Hey everyone, Delve here. You can check out my channels here. Today I'm going to cover Pyromancy in Dark Souls 2. Now, Pyromancy in Dark Souls was probably the strongest type of character you could build in some ways. And it was viable spellcasting for literally any kind of character. In Dark Souls 2, it seems like they put a lot of effort into making Pyromancy more support-oriented, and that it's really more something that you add on to other types of characters. But with that being said, you can still sort of make use of Pyromancy alone, but just like other types of spellcasting, it doesn't quite work out that way. So we'll start with the upsides. The main one is that you do have access to some interesting spellcasting. Now in practice, the spellcasting is just inferior to either intelligence or faith, in my opinion. You have some okay damage options, including typical fireballs, which are a little underwhelming. But you also have some AoE spells which can consistently knock down enemies. Not great in terms of damage, but a potential solution to large crowds of enemies. Probably the best damage spell that pyromancies have access to are poison and toxic spells, which are a mixed bag. In some cases they're really good, in others not so much because enemies tend to be immune to them. But taken all together, you do still of course have some nice offensive options. And of course the support pyromancies are also surprisingly good as well. Mostly Flash Sweat, this greatly increases your fire defenses, which is actually pretty useful in this game, as many bosses deal fire damage. All in all, the spellcasting is lackluster, but it's still an option and can be used to kill most pre-DLC bosses, and it's great for a character who isn't dedicated in spellcasting anyway, or it's at least okay. Okay, so next is the weapons, which come with fire, as well as fire infusions. In practice, these are great weapons for any character, and a large number of these are actually really solid weapons. The weapons, which come with fire, might be the best elemental weapons in the game in terms of their power and movesets. You have a wide variety of options, including a series of unique and powerful slow weapons, and a solid rapier as well. Now you might imagine that these weapons are just fine for basically any type of character, not just a character who uses pyromancy. However, pyromancers also have access to the flame weapon Pyromancy, which is a buff spell adding additional fire damage to a weapon. On top of that, any character could hypothetically gain access to this buff spell, regardless of their stats, so it makes these fire weapons even more attractive as an option. And why I talk about fire weapons and I'm talking about fire buff spell is it's when you pair them you get more damage in the fire element, and that helps circumnavigate enemy defenses, right? So obviously there are some downsides as well. The biggest downside to pyromancies is that they are actually a pain to get your hands on. You can't start as a pyromancer, and the way you obtain the pyromancy flame is to kill the Flexile Sentry, which is usually the fourth boss of the game. Now you could theoretically kill Flexile Sentry as the second boss, but that's the earliest you could possibly do it. There might be a convoluted way to get access to pyromancies without killing Flexile Sentry, but it's essentially exactly as much work as it would be just to kill the Flexile Sentry. Even when you do get access to the Pyromancy Flame and rescue the Pyromancy Trainer, your offensive options are still fairly lackluster, and it will take you quite a bit more time to accumulate some of the more impressive Pyromancies. Even when you do, you never really get that many casts of any of the best ones, so it ends up being a little underwhelming as far as an offensive option goes. This is worsened by the fact that not only do all DLC bosses take half damage from spells, but it also seems like most NPC invaders in the game also take reduced damage from pyromancies, or have massive amounts of built-in fire resist for some reason. I can't say I'm a tremendous fan of pyromancy spellcasting, all things considered, but it's not completely useless. The next downside is the scaling. Pyromancies and fire weapons do scale with stats in this game, unlike in Dark Souls. They scale with both faith and intelligence up to a combined cap of 60, which can be any amount of either of the two stats. In practice, even when you have that combined 60 total, the damage you gain via scaling is actually quite small, and that's a problem because the damage that pyromancies have is already quite weak. So it's unimpressive even with scaling, and you kind of need the scaling because it needs every little bit of damage that you can get out of it. The scaling was obviously meant to be a nice bonus for another kind of spellcaster to make pyromancies a little more attractive for an int or faith character. But sadly, you're looking at spending a lot of levels for a pretty small amount of extra damage, so it's not a particularly efficient use of your levels. Although obviously, you'll still have access to whatever weapons or spells that come along with that amount of int or faith as well, so it's a little more tough to gauge how much you are really getting for your level ups. Keep in mind that fire weapons also scale with fire damage, right? So they also scale with int and faith as well, making it a little, so you're gaining maybe 20-30 damage from scaling total on a fire weapon. Still, pyromancies themselves tend to underwhelm, in my opinion, but they aren't completely terrible, and you can still make use of the scaling just fine. Okay, so to get started on the game progression, I think Scholar might be better here. The differences are small, but it's easier to obtain a fragrant branch of Yoran Scholar, which is crucial for rescuing the Pyromancy trainer. As for starting class, it's really up to you. The Sorcerer class would be nice since they start with high attunement. I went with Swordsman because the high starting dexterity can prove quite useful with certain fire scaling weapons. As I already mentioned, you can't start with Pyromancies, so you might be tempted to head to Hyde's Tower of Flame to start on obtaining the Pyromancy Flame. The downside to this is that it's tougher to do, and in fact considerably tougher to do in my opinion. And even if you do go all the way to No Man's Wharf immediately, the effectiveness of Pyromancies is still going to be disappointing when you do get them. So I actually recommend heading to Forest of Fallen Giants and getting your hands on the Estus Flash shards, as well as some Titanite shards. I also picked up the Fire Longsword. This is a solid weapon for most of the game. Next I headed to Hyde's Tower of Flame and then to No Man's Wharf. The Pyromancy Flame is in the chest after the boss Flexile Sentry, and it comes with Fireball. This is a pretty disappointing spell, so the next thing is to save the Pyromancy trainer, Rosabeth of Melfia, who can be found on the path towards Shaded Woods. To unpetrify her, you'll need a fragrant branch of Yor, and she'll return to Majula once you've given her some armor to wear. Rosabeth of Melfia sells some Pyromancies. Most of them are only okay, not amazing. Probably the most useful one she sells is Flash Sweat, which is a little sad when you think about it, but they are fine. She can also upgrade your Pyromancy Flame, but it requires a Fire Seed to do, which are an upgrade material which can be found throughout the world. Carillion of the Fold can also upgrade your Pyromancy Flame, and Rosabeth of Melfia will drop a Fire Seed when killed. At this point you have some Pyromancies, but you won't really have enough spellcasts to get anywhere, and the damage is unimpressive. Therefore, I recommend acquiring a weapon as a backup. The Fire Longsword is great, but you can also have some other fairly interesting options. For one, you have the Chaos Rapier, which can be bought from Falcon the Outcast. It has a minimum faith and intelligence requirement of 13, but it's still a rapier, so it's overpowered. The main thing is that you don't want to infuse this weapon. The next option this early is the Black Knight Halberd, which is an absurdly strong weapon with some serious catches. It can be found in the Shaded Woods. How you obtain it is you jump through this window and drop down onto this bridge. The downsides are twofold. The first one is that it has a dexterity requirement of 26, which is pretty high. The other downside is the so-called sweet spot. The basic premise is that if you attack an enemy that's too close, you'll be hitting them with the handle as opposed to the blade. While this weapon deals absurdly high damage, it will only manage this if you consistently hit enemies with the sweet spot, which is tough to do. This weapon is cool, and it's good for a while, but in the long term I don't recommend it. Anytime you don't sweet spot with it, it's abysmal, and that will happen fairly frequently in my experience. Therefore, I do not recommend upgrading it, at least past +2. You'll almost certainly want to save your Twinkling Titanite for another weapon, such as the Chaos Rapier. Okay, so there's 3 different places you could head for more Pyromancies. I started by going to the Huntsman's Copse, because after killing Executioner Chariot, you can join the Brotherhood of Blood Covenant. Well, actually, you'll need a token of Spite first, which can be found in the entrance to the gutter, so maybe you want to put this one off till later. The Pyromancies that Tichigren sells are okay, nothing ridiculous. The best one is probably Fire Whip, since it can stagger enemies surprisingly consistently. The next place I headed was to unpetrify Strayed in the Last Bastille, as he also sells Pyromancies, although I find his Pyromancies to be difficult to use. The main use for Strayed is the Pyromancies from Boss Souls. Some of these are actually quite strong. Most notably, Toxic Mist can be used to great effect alongside Poison Mist to deal with bosses resistant to fire, such as Smelter Demon and Old Iron King. Note that these are dubiously useful against the fire-resistant endgame and DLC bosses, but they still stand out for their niche uses against some enemies. Similarly, Strayed will also trade the Old Witch Soul for Flame Weapon, the super useful fire buff spell. The Old Witch Soul drops from Lost Sinner after having burned a bonfire ascetic at the Salt Fort bonfire. The issue is defeating Lost Sinner again. I find the rematch to be exceptionally difficult, especially when compared to the first time. During the fight, 2 Pyromancers will spawn that will use Pyromancies to stagger you, and the bright lights and the particle effects from the spells will obscure your vision as well, making it a rather annoying fight. The Pyromancers themselves are extremely fragile to physical attacks though, but I went with just ignoring them. This can be accomplished by stacking the Fire Resistance Ring alongside Flash Sweat. Even still, the boss is quite difficult, and I highly recommend putting this off at least until you have a fully upgraded weapon. Speaking of Lost Sinner, after defeating her the first time, Mala in the Armor will sell her armor, after you've spent 15,000 souls in his shop. Most of the armor is useless, but the Penal Cuffs boost the damage of Pyromancies by a cool 8%, which is pretty impressive by the standards of this game. Tragically, there aren't actually very many Pyromancies left to discuss, although at least one of them is pretty useful. The first is Chaos Storm, which can be located with some difficulty by dropping onto this molten walkway and then opening the chest. To do this, start by equipping as much fire resistance as you can via armor and the fire resistance ring, as well as the silver cat ring. Then smash the pots in the room up the ladder to get wet, which reduces fire damage some more. And then finally, get into position, apply flash sweat and an orange burr, and then use a life gem before dropping down. Before opening the chest, chug some Estus so you don't die in the middle of the animation. This spell is not at all worth the effort, as it doesn't really deal damage and instead just knocks enemies down. There are several other spells like this, and they're all alright in some scenarios against crowds of enemies. The next spell is arguably the most important, so you could skip ahead and do this one before getting any of the other pyromancies. After killing the Duke's Dear Freya and Brightstone Cove Seldora, you'll get a key from the Duke which will unlock the door in the room right after the weird stone spikes. Behind this door is a chest containing the Pyromancy Great Fireball. This is probably the strongest Pyromancy in the game, although you'll never really have enough casts of it for it to be especially impressive. You can't even farm more copies of it since it's in an iron chest. The chest also contains a Black Knight Ultra Greatsword though. This is my personal recommendation for a weapon to use for the rest of the run, and it's great with the fire infusion and buffed with flame weapon. Unfortunately, it upgrades with Twinkling Titanite, which is why I recommended earlier not to upgrade the Black Knight Halberd. This weapon looks like a typical greatsword, but the R2 is actually really good at consistently knocking enemies down, making this weapon extremely powerful at controlling enemies. Only two more relevant pyromancies. The first is Warmth, which is sold by Cryptkeeper Agdane. This is an extremely unique spell that creates a localized healing area, and it heals more than basically any other spell in the game over the course of its duration. The problem is that it can also heal enemies, so be aware of that. And lastly, the final pyromancy, Forbidden Sun. This can be obtained by completing Navlan's questline in Aldea's Keep, up until the point where you have to kill Falcon. Be aware that he will give you the staff at 20 int and 20 faith, and I also recommend not killing him so that you can buy the Chaos Rapier from him. Navlan's questline is too complex for this video, but the main points here are don't release him and make sure you are hollow when you talk to him. The spell itself is alright, it does good damage and casts quickly, but it's very difficult to get more casts of it. And also it's impossible to obtain more copies either, so it's kind of underwhelming, although still useful anyway. And that's really the last pyromancy in the game. There are 3 pyromancies in the DLC, but they're really more novelties than anything else in my opinion. Too little too late, and they don't even really do anything good anyway. As for dealing with the DLC, obviously you'll want Flame Weapon and weapons which take fire infusions good. As I mentioned, I personally recommend the Black Knight Ultra Greatsword and the Chaos Rapier. Both are exceptional weapons against normal enemies and bosses alike. The problem with pairing these two is that they are both Twinkling Titanite weapons. Fortunately, I found a really good spot for farming Twinkling Titanite. Simply burn a bonfire ascetic at the Ruin Fork Road bonfire in the Shaded Woods, and then head in the direction of Drangleic Castle. You will have to fight 5 Falconers in Scholar of the First Sin, but hidden behind the tower is a body containing 2 Twinkling Titanite. This is probably the most efficient way to farm Twinkling Titanite in the game. Now you might assume that these weapons would not be capable of dealing with the Fume Tower enemies and bosses. This is not true. I actually found these weapons to be acceptably useful against these enemies and bosses. Unfortunately, I think that both Suralon and Fume Knight are immune to poison and toxic, so you don't really have a better option anyway. You'll still deal solid thrust damage with the Chaos Rapier, assuming you don't infuse it, and it loses damage if you do that anyway. As for rings and armor, the usual suspects are always applicable. Ring of Blades, Flynn's Ring, Ring of the Third Dragon, and Chloranthy Ring are always solid options. Fire damage can also be boosted by using Fire Clutch Ring, which can be found in the Ivory King DLC, although it's fairly well hidden. And then of course for spellcasting, Clear Bluestone Ring would be useful, as well as any other attunement or cast speed related rings and armors. Lastly, the Penal Handcuffs, which I already mentioned. These can be obtained from Maul in the Armor after killing Lost Sinner, if you've already spent 15,000 in his shop. As for level ups, this is where your character gets kind of interesting, because I do not recommend boosting Pyromancy casting right at the start. At the start, I'd recommend preparing for whatever weapons you want to use, so in my case I put 11 points into Dexterity so I could use Black Knight Halberd, and you can always redistribute your level ups later if you want to switch a weapon. From there, it's a tough balancing act, but I tend to recommend focusing on adaptability when in doubt. Having 105 agility is very good, and it gives you a lot of room for error on dodges. But investing in Interfaith isn't at all a bad idea either, and you will gain some damage from scaling. Attunement doesn't really need to go over 30, although unfortunately pyromancies tend to require high attunement before getting extra spellcasts. I definitely recommend hitting 20 Vigor and Endurance before putting too many points into Interfaith, but I did get both Int and Faith to 30 overall. And then of course from there, hitting 111 agility and then dumping any extra points into vigor, I think is a solid way to cap off the character. Okay, so that's the Dark Souls 2 Pyromancy guide. All in all, I think Pyromancies are pretty okay. Not amazing, but you will end up with a solid generalist character with access to good weapons, which isn't bad. It's tough to get the ball rolling though, which hasn't been the case with any other characters thus far, so I do have to say that I think Pyromancy is probably less good than even maybe Faith. But it's still not bad. Thanks for watching.